Russia has no victories. Putin cannot further motivate his society. He cannot send his soldiers into death that easily anymore.
I would take anything coming out of the Kremlin with a very large shaker of salt.
The US has announced a new $300 million military aid package for Ukraine. It will include, among other things, additional ammunition for HIMARS, Hydra 70 air defense missiles, mortar and artillery shells. However, Ukraine still hopes to receive modern fighter jets, which are essential for the upcoming counteroffensive from its Western partners. More on the preparations for the offensive and the situation at the front lines in our review.
The front line in the Bakhmut sector is in the area of Soledar, which Russians managed to capture in January. The Luhansk border guard detachment holds a position separated from the Russian trenches by about 400 meters of open field. The battle continues around the clock.
Добре, є. Супер.
We work with small arms and RPGs. How are the Russians behaving lately? They run around the mice in the field. They are running around not knowing what to do.
In Bakhmut itself, there have been no significant changes in recent days. Defense forces are fighting in the western part of the city and continue to control the road to it. Over the past 5 months, Russia has lost more than 100,000 troops in the Bakhmut sector in killed and wounded, said White House National Security Advisor John Kirby. The other day, the commander of the Eastern Military Group, Oleksandr, visited the defenders of Bakhmut and reported the armed forces of Ukraine managed to counterattack and repel the occupiers in certain areas near Bakhmut.
We continue to hold Bakhmut, destroying Wagner's forces and other most capable units of the Russian army. Despite all the forecasts and advice, we are allowing our reserves to prepare, and we are preparing ourselves for further actions.
When the Ukrainian army launches a counteroffensive, the intensity of fighting in the Bakhmut sector will decrease significantly. The Russians will take defensive positions, transferring reserves to deter our troops, said expert Roman Svitan.
Russians are in a very precarious position on the Zaporizhia and Kherson directions due to geography and the location of the front line. There is a flat surface, no water obstacles or heights. It is very difficult to hold on in such conditions, so the army that is ready to attack will definitely throw the army that is pressed against the Azov coast into the sea. This, in my opinion, will be one of the main results of our future offensive. But without modern aviation, the advance will be much slower and the losses in the offensive operation will be much greater.
But Ukraine still hopes to receive modern bombers from the West. In particular, Commander-in-Chief Valery Zaluzhny spoke about this on May the 1st in the telephone conversation with Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley, as well as during a meeting with Supreme Allied Commander Europe Christopher Cavoli.
And now I am joined by Volodymyr Yelchenko, Ambassador, Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations in 2015-2019. Mr. Yelchenko, greetings and thanks for joining me today. So my first question to you would be as follows. Russia continues to commit crimes, shelling Ukrainian cities and killing innocent Ukrainians. Not even the arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court against the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, led to the suspension of the aggressor's membership in the UN Security Council, or at least its presidency. What other mechanisms exist for total restriction of the aggressor in the international arena?
Well, there are several ways to do it. Yeah, I would prefer that our diplomats would raise the issue of Russian delegations' credentials, which was the case at least several times in UN history. For example, in 1956, after the Soviet Union invaded Hungary and installed the puppet regime there in Budapest, the credentials of the Hungarian delegation were suspended or frozen, and it continued at least for 2 years. Another example is South African Republic. During the times of apartheid regime in this country, starting from, if I remember correctly, from 1974 and until the first democratic elections in the country in 1994, when Nelson Mandela was elected the president, the credentials of the South African delegation were suspended. And delegation could not, well, they just didn't have a physical possibility to participate in the meetings, to vote, to deliver statements, and so on. So this is the easiest way, because if we go for expansion of Russia from the UN, it will take more time. And even if Russia is recognized as aggressor in Ukraine, the UN Charter is very vague, and it's not easy to collect enough votes in the General Assembly to expel Russia from the UN. It is possible, but it will take much more time, because many countries are simply afraid of the precedent. Today is Russia, tomorrow it will be our country.
But Mr. Yelchenko, how more time to your estimates?
I think that the best time would be on the eve of the next session of the General Assembly, which is to be convened in early September this year. Well, there is a credentials committee of the UN General Assembly, which, as a rule, has the first meeting before the session starts, a couple of days before it. It can be early September or the second week of September. And if we raise this issue in the Credentials Committee, I think that we can have a successful story. The other way is to use the credentials mechanism in the UN Security Council. Although this body is just one of the bodies of the United Nations, like the General Assembly, but they have their own rules of procedure. And in case when one or more delegations would question the credentials of the Russian delegation in the Security Council, this is going to be voted in the Council. And in this case, the veto right is not applicable, because this is the procedural question. This is not the substantial issue. In that case, you need just to collect 9 out of 15 votes, simple majority. And I think that given the composition of the Security Council, we can certainly have 9 or even more countries which would go for which would support our case and just suspend the credential delegation.
Ambassador, what did China change its attitude to Russian aggression in Ukraine so dramatically during the vote in UN General Assembly?
Well, it's not an easy question, but I think that, well, first of all, after the visit of the head of People's Republic of China to Moscow, they had a couple of agreements which Russia started to break, well, just a couple of days after. I mean, first of all, the transfer of nuclear weapons to the territory of Belarus, because we know for sure that China is one of the most adamant opponents of the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons. And I'm pretty sure that this was one of the topics during the conversations in Moscow. And President Putin, you know, just ignored the agreements which were reached in Moscow. And secondly, during the visit of French President Macron to Beijing a couple of days later, they also talked about the same topic. And China was waiting. I think that the reason why China at least tried to be neutral during the first year of this terrible war is that they were not pretty sure what will be the final development of this war. Now they can see that they are certainly, I mean, in case if they would choose to support Russia, they would find themselves on the wrong side of history. That's why I think that, well, Chinese diplomacy and Chinese politics are very wise people. They calculated, very carefully what will be the circumstances, what will be the consequences of Chinese support of Russia. And the first consequence would be the new sanctions of the Western countries, United States and European Union against China, which is very bad for China because China needs economic development. China is very reliable on the Western European and American and Canadian and Japanese and South Korean technologies. They would certainly, if they have a choice, they would certainly choose, Western side rather than the Russian side. But it took some time. And after the telephone conversation between the Chinese leader and Ukrainian President Zelensky, I think the final decision was made in China, in Beijing. The final decision, unfortunately, is not to support Ukraine, but we still hope that is going to happen. But at least China from neutral, step by step, they are becoming, as I say, neutral positive. And the first sign of that and the first result was the positive vote in the General Assembly. Because, well, this is just one of the resolutions of the General Assembly. There's nothing dramatic about that. But what is important is that China, as you rightly said, for the first time, after many months, and even starting from 2014, when this war has started, that was the first time when China voted yes for the resolution where the Russian aggression against Ukraine is openly named. And what is even more important is that together with China, again, for the first time, countries like Brazil, India, or, for example, Kazakhstan and Armenia also supported this resolution. They voted yes. And the final result of this vote is that Russia was supported only by 4 countries. There were only 5 votes against this resolution: Russia, North Korea, Belarus, Syria, and Nicaragua.
Quite a company.
These are, this is the best company one can imagine.
Oh yeah.
The best countries in the world, the promoters of the human rights, and so on and so forth. Even during the Soviet time, the Soviet Union, even during the worst times after the invasion to Afghanistan, for example, the Soviet Union had a very solid support of many African, Asian, Latin American countries, but Russia overstepped even the best Soviet experience. So now they can be proud of having this mighty coalition of just 4 countries in favor of Russia.
Quite a good coalition. Ambassador, since you've been a permanent representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, you know this organization quite well from inside. And based on what you know, is the UN important to the world in its current form in order to solve such security issues as we have, for example, right now, unfortunately, in Ukraine?
This is a very difficult question for me because I devoted at least half of my career, or even more, to the UN issues. But to be frank with you, I think that in the current shape, UN is I think it exhausted its potential, at least in the political sphere. Yes, the United Nations still delivers a lot of good things and good results, for example, in economic and financial sphere, in the fighting the climate change, even in the field of human rights, although there are, like the countries which I mentioned, the supporters of Russia, plus probably the Islamic Republic of Iran and a couple of more, they are still there, although they are the biggest violators of the human rights in the human history. But still, out of 193 members of the United Nations, the vast majority is devoted to human rights. And as I said, climate change. This is one of the issues which is probably not so important for Ukrainians right now, but this is a very important issue, and there should be some international organizations, dealing with that. But if you go back to 1945, to Yalta Conference and San Francisco Conference, when the UN Charter was elaborated and signed, this organization, first of all, was created for the sake of preserving peace. And the system of collective security, which was created by the UN Charter and later added by a number of very important regional organizations like the OSCE or even NATO and European Union, and there are many more other regional organizations, African Union, the League of Arab States, the Asian organizations, and they worked in unison for many, many decades. But now this system is about to collapse. You might say that it already collapsed. And it started not with the Russian invasion in Ukraine. It started from the events in the former Yugoslavia in the early 90s. Then we had the problems in many countries of Africa. We had Syrian conflict. We had Russian invasion in Georgia. And finally, occupation of Crimea and the large-scale war of Russia against Ukraine. All of it should have been prevented if the UN Charter would be recognized by all countries. But Russia seemed to ignore all existing international norms, the norms of international law, the UN Charter, the OSCE principles, and so on and so forth, which means that if organization is not able to prevent the major war in Europe, and I mentioned many other wars from Yugoslavia, in Africa, Arab-Israeli conflict, and Syrian war, that means that the system is not working well. We remember what had happened to the League of Nations before the Second World War. I think that something like that is about to happen with the United Nations. I don't believe that this organization can be reformed, at least until Russia is a part of this organization, and not just the ordinary part, but the country which is a permanent member of the UN Security Council with the veto right.
Well, it's unfortunate.
While Russia is sitting there, we cannot say anything about the possibility of reforming this organization. So I think that after the Ukrainian victory in this war, the new organization should be launched. It is a difficult process. It's not easy. It will take not weeks and months. It might take years, but it needs to be done. And like after the Second World War, when the countries which were the victory coalition in that war, first of all, the United States, the United Kingdom, later, Soviet Union, of course, and later joined by France and China. Now, I think that Ukraine, as one of the future victors in this war, should also play a very active part in the creation of the new organization.
And we will play. Mr. Yelchenko, Ambassador, thank you very much for joining me today and answering my questions. This was Volodymyr Yelchenko, Ambassador, Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations in 2015-2019. This is Spotlight Ukraine. More to come. Russia accused Ukraine of a failed attempt to assassinate Russian President Vladimir Putin in a drone attack on the Kremlin and threatened to retaliate. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Kyiv had nothing to do with the reported overnight incident. Shortly after the Kremlin announcement, Ukraine reported alerts for the airstrikes over the capital Kyiv and other cities. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, now deputy head of Russia's Security Council, said the incident leaves us no option but to physically eliminate Zelensky and his clique.
After this terrorist attack, there are no options left aside the physical elimination of Zelensky and his cabal.
Russians do not stop terrorizing Ukrainian cities. Kyiv has been under attack with rockets and drones for almost a week. The city has now experienced such a dense intensity of attacks since the beginning of the year, the city administration said. The-occupied Kherson also experienced a large-scale attack on the morning of May 3. The railway square, the railway station, a supermarket, a gas station and a factory came under attack. 23 people were killed and 46 others were injured, including 2 children. Russia's terror against the civilian population of Ukraine. They do not receive the status of prisoners of war, so they have much less chance of returning home. Almost 2,000 Ukrainian civilians are being held captive by Russia. Among the prisoners are both adults and children who were abducted, illegally imprisoned or deported to the territory of the terrorist country. Residents of the occupied territories who are forced to renounce their Ukrainian citizenship under the duress are also hostages of the invaders. Russia terrorizing the civil population of Ukraine. Next in our review.
She put on a black fur coat and I gave her my ox. As she was leaving, she kissed me and asked to say goodbye to her father.
Katerina's daughter was taken prisoner by the Russians on March 25th last year. The occupiers came to their house in the village of Stary Bykiv, Chernihiv region, and searched it. They found correspondence with the Ukrainian military on the phone of 25-year-old teacher Victoria. She was accused of adjusting the fire. The woman spent 6 months in a pre-trial detention center in Kursk, Russia.
When they were taking me away, they asked, "And what about her?" They said to everyone, which meant that I had to go through the so-called reception like all the men. They used their special means. It was different, but I don't want to go into details. It's not because it's hard for me, it will be hard for my family to hear. They threatened me, beat me, and even said they would burn me alive.
In Russia, the woman says, Ukrainian prisoners are abused both physically and morally. Prisoners are forced to sing the Russian anthem and so-called patriotic songs for hours on end and are forbidden to communicate with each other in Ukrainian. For Victoria, the nightmare is over. Human rights activists helped to free her. According to the Ukrainian Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights, Russia is holding more than 20,000 Ukrainian civilians in captivity. After the full-scale invasion, law enforcement officers opened nearly 2,000 cases of abduction and illegal detention of civilians by the occupiers. There is no legal mechanism for the return of prisoners taken to Russia. According to the Geneva Conventions, only the exchange of prisoners of war is possible.
Sometimes civilians returned with groups of prisoners of war, but these were not exchanges. Much more often, the Russian Federation simply released some civilians. If Russia exchanges Ukrainian civilians for its prisoners of war, it actually grants Ukrainian civilians the status of civilian hostages. That is, it signs for taking hostages, and this is very, very serious crime.
Since the beginning of the full-scale war, only 140 Ukrainian civilians have been released from Russian captivity. But the terrorist country is not only holding adults hostage. After the invasion, more than 19,000 Ukrainian children, including almost 5,000 orphans, were illegally deported to Russia. The Kremlin is proud to be kidnapping little Ukrainians, separating them from their families, illegally giving them up for adoption, and re-educating them in the spirit of Russian propaganda.
Did you adopt a child from Mariupol?
Yes,
yourself?
thanks to you.
A small one?
No, 15 years old. Now I know what it's like to be a mother of a child from Donbass.
Following this public confession by Russian ombudsman Maria Lvova-Belova to dictator Vladimir Putin, the International Criminal Court in The Hague issued an arrest warrant for the illegal deportation of Ukrainian children. According to Putin's decree, all residents of the occupied territories face deportation if they do not exchange their Ukrainian passports for Russian ones by July 2024. Those who do not want to change their citizenship are denied medical care, threatened with dismissal from their jobs, and restricted in their movement, even in the temporarily occupied territories.
Oleksandr Pavlichenko, Executive Director of the Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union, joins me now. Mr. Pavlichenko, greetings and thanks for joining.
Hello and greetings from my side.
So, the Russians continue to forcibly abduct pro-Ukrainian civilians in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine and set up a new torture chambers to hold them. What are the mechanisms for the release of civilian prisoners from Russian captivity?
For the time being, we have not too much possibility to influence on the situation with the civilian hostages captured on occupied territories of Ukraine by Russian military forces or current regime introduced on these territories. We have dozens or even hundreds of persons, Ukrainian citizens who continue to stay on the occupied territories, and they are the victims of the illegal detention. Sometimes we are speaking about the persons who participate in different type of resistance actions, and it was especially in the first months of the occupation of this territory, but still it's continuing practice. The question on the possible deliberation or the influence on the destiny of these civilian hostages is in the hands of the, first of all, international instruments and international organizations like ICHR, International Committee of the Red Cross. But in the routine practice, ICHR representatives are refused to visit even the places of detention, and they are allowed to visit such places only in the, let's say, prepared situation when they may see only the order and no violations of the human rights, the beaten persons, the traces of tortures are not demonstrated, and even the conditions of detentions in very different locations are let's say, presented as normal. So we have.
May I say that these international instruments you were talking about are not often effective because of what you've just said?
Yeah, they have very limited mandate to influence on the situation, and fairly speaking, it's not the strong instrument, a kind of remedy that might ameliorate the situation and the conditions of detention. At least this is this single instrument because we expect on the third party a kind of state who will protect the rights of the person in detentions, playing the role of the humanitarian mediator, so-called third party provided even in the Geneva Convention, neutral country. Possibly it might be China, Turkey, Kazakhstan, or other countries by choice of both sides, Ukraine and Russia, who are the parts of this war. But till today, we have not such a third country protector, and still we have the situation as it is. And I may just made one appreciation that we have two types of civilian hostages. First type, and it's very limited, we have only dozens of such persons. They are in the, let's say, official detention places like pretrial detention centers, SIZO, Slidчий изоляторы, or ITT, and they still are under some control. But we have also illegal detention places where are hundreds of the persons, like in Pervomaisk, recently opened the illegal detention place, and we have dozens of similar illegal detention places. It's rather torture places than detention places, where the person may spend from some days till some months in inhuman conditions and under the tortures. So these illegal detention places represent the very problematic situation with the possibility to get the at least information on the persons who are in these detention places, and without any possibility even to visit them with the mentioned earlier international representatives of ICHR or possibly other international groups of monitors who may just monitor and contact the persons who are in these captivities. And Russia should be also investigated and properly, let's say, appreciated and punished by this violation of international humanitarian law, because we are speaking about the attitude towards the civil population on occupied territory, and Geneva Convention number 4 protect the civilians against such inhuman treatment, and this grave violation of IHL should be considered by both national investigation services, national police, Office of the Prosecutor General, and possibly by international structures like International Criminal Court.
Yeah, I see, but punishment, I think it will be Quite a long history, I think, but it will be. And the Russian occupiers continue to force passportization of the population of the temporarily occupied territory of Kherson region. To speed up this process, the invaders conduct demonstrative raids aimed at intimidating the local population with possible deportation and alienation of property. If these people are taken to Russia, how can they be returned to Ukraine?
Well, we are speaking about the recent decree signed by Putin on 27th of April. It's decree number 308 on passportization, let's say forced passportization of the population on the occupied territories. They are titled by other terminology, and we are speaking about the let's say the continuation of the practice of deleting the Ukrainian nationality, and I may appreciate it as the traces of genocide practice towards Ukrainian population on occupied territories. Practice demonstrated in Crimea since 2014, in Donetsk, Lugansk regions again since 2014, 2015, and now we have the continuation of such a practice. The first stage was, let's say, the proposal to get the Russian passports and Russian citizenship, and now it's the use of the force, because provided measures prescribe the time limits to receive the Russian citizenship and the Russian passport, and then to receive the obligations related and linked to this Russian citizenship, like military obligation and other, let's say, rights and duties, but rather duties than rights for the persons who will get the Russian citizenship. How to avoid or what to do, it's the good question, because it's from case to case should be considered separately, and sometimes the benefits and the threats are different in every case. But for the men, for example, who might be asked to come to the military service, the risk for this received citizenship is much higher than for example, for the handicapped person or other vulnerable groups of population who requires on social assistance, medical assistance, and it brings them some benefits when they will get the Russian passports. When the person will receive these Russian passports, they may continue to use their Ukrainian citizenship, because they will not stop this citizenship, and they will continue to have possibility to return to Ukraine at any possible circumstances. And when they will, for example, send to some Russian regions, they may try to return to via third countries like Georgia, like in the eastern side or in western side, Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia. They have special procedures and corridors for the repatriants, for the person from Ukraine who tried to return to Ukraine from Russia, from sometimes it's deportation, sometimes it's just person who avoided stay in the situation of the battles. Yeah.
And I hope more and more Ukrainians will at least try to come back after they were abducted and again to become Ukrainian citizens. Thank you very much, Mr. Pavlichenko, for taking part in this program. This was Oleksandr Pavlichenko, Executive Director of the Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union, and we were talking about people who were abducted to Russia and how can they return to Ukraine. This is Spotlight Ukraine. More to come. And it's time in Spotlight Ukraine to break Russian fakes. And to do this, we invite our partners from StopFake. They are working 24/7 to tell all the world the truth about what is really happening in Ukraine and about all the crimes Russians are committing in our country. And right now, I am joined by Ruslan Deynychenko, Executive Director of StopFake. Ruslan, greetings and thanks for joining.
Hello, Yuri.
Okay, let's turn immediately to our first fake. For the second month in a row, pro-Kremlin propaganda has been spreading a fake about the golden Rolls-Royce of the head of National Bank of Ukraine. The luxury car was allegedly bought with money provided by the international partners. Our journalists will tell you what kind of supercar it is and who actually owns it.
A photo of a golden Rolls-Royce at the entrance to the National Bank of Ukraine first appeared in pro-Kremlin media in late March. Citing unnamed publicists, the propagandists claimed that the luxury car belonged to the NBU governor Andriy Pyshny.
According to the local publics, the owner of the luxury cars, the head of the National Bank of Ukraine, Andriy Pyshny, is standing next to the car. According to Ukrainian media, his car is constantly seen near the NBU, and he enters through the checkpoint.
The NBU officially denied that the car belonged to Andriy Pyshny on social media. Additionally, in a comment to StopFake, the owner of the Rolls-Royce was reported to have parked illegally near the bank and gone to have coffee. He received a warning from the security guards and left afterwards.
The car is not owned or used by any NBU employee. Since the photo shows the license plate, it will not be difficult to identify the owner.
Despite being refuted, propagandists continue to spread the fake. Recently, a video was posted on Telegram channels showing Andriy Pyshny allegedly speeding away in a Rolls-Royce, accompanied by a motorcade. The video was published when Pyshny was at a meeting of the IMF and the World Bank in Washington, the NBU said. As for the golden Rolls-Royce, it probably belongs to Hennady Vatsak, a member of the Vinnytsia Regional Council and businessman. This car within his elite fleet is mentioned by two Ukrainian publications, Top Zhir and Tvoya Mashina. The place of the last registration of the car is Vinnytsia region, and the date is February 2022, 7 months before Andriy Pyshny became the head of the NBU.
So, Ruslan, as far as I understand, this fake is spread by Russian propaganda for quite a long time, for 2 months, I think. Is it because people don't really believe it, or this is too important topic for Russian propaganda?
Well, the more you repeat, the more people will be exposed to this disinformation and the more people will trust it. And I think this exact fake target is a Ukrainian population, first of all. Our Russian partners, they want to persuade Ukrainians that their government betrayed them. And when we all collect money and in order to help our army, our government officials, they spend huge money to buy such a car.
Well, the more they repeat this fake, the more we break this fake together with you. But are they successful in spreading this kind of fakes?
Unfortunately, in this case, they have kind of friends inside of Ukraine. Some Ukrainian politicians help Russian propaganda to promote this disinformation and this fake. We don't know why. We don't know the reason. I assume someone just got payment for that, or have their own political interest. But we should be aware that sometimes Ukrainian politicians or people inside Ukraine help intentionally or unintentionally to promote Russian disinformation.
Oh, I see. Okay, let's turn to our second fake. The British are allegedly predicting the defeat of NATO and Ukrainian armed forces because of the Russian tank armada. Another sensation of Russian propaganda, and this is sensation. Let's take a look at what the UK media actually says about the Russian tanks being touted by Russia.
Referring to random comments under an article of the British website Daily Mail, Russian propaganda created another sensational fake. Daily Mail readers predict the defeat of NATO and the Ukrainian armed forces because of Russian Armata tanks in the area of the eastern Ukraine. Watch out, NATO, because in the end you might get a nosebleed from this news, said the pain list. The original article on the Daily Mail's website, titled "Putin sends his invisible T-14 Armata tanks into battle for the first time in Ukraine after UK says using poorly maintained fleet is high risk for Russia," is skeptical of the supposedly devastating Russian tanks. Production is probably only in the low tens, while commanders are unlikely to trust the vehicle in combat, the British military said. The T-14 would also pose a logistical headache for Russia, as it is larger and heavier than other Russian tanks. The publication emphasizes that these tanks are primarily used for Russian propaganda purposes and not as effective combat vehicles on the battlefield.
So, Ruslan, it's kind of strange fake, to be honest. They could have found something more serious than Russian tank armata, because it's not yet available in Ukraine and even broke during one of the parades on Red Square in Moscow. But obviously this article was ordered or even written by the Russians. But why? What is the main reason?
Well, I think the primary audience for this fake was a Russian audience, and Russian propaganda and Kremlin wants Russians to know that billions of dollars were not spent or stolen by Kremlin officials, and these wonderful weapons that they are praising, Russia really has. And they use this approach when the Russian propagandists, they leave comments on some foreign website or newspaper, and then they represent that this is the opinion of British public or American public or German public. It was a very popular meme when Bulgarian, all the time, the Bulgarian praised something produced in Russia, Russian cars, Russian tanks, Russian weapons, and so on and so on.
Ruslan, you said Russians believe this is wonderful weapons, and I like it. Okay, let's turn to our third fake for today, and it will be last fake for today. The Kremlin media claim that Kyiv is allegedly going to seize or destroy nuclear power plants located on the territory of Russian Federation. In support of this announcement, the former first deputy commander of the Special Operation Forces of Armed Forces of Ukraine, Serhiy Krivonos, was quoted on one of the Ukrainian TV channels. Let's see what the military officer actually said.
Kyiv militants may respond to the seizure of Zaporizhia NPP by Russian troops by attacking nuclear facilities in Russia, Regnum News Agency writes, quoting Ukrainian Major General Serhiy Krivonos. They also have nuclear power plants, and in some respects, it is easier not to liberate Zaporizhia NPP, but to capture or disable a nuclear power plant in Russia.
They also have nuclear power plants, and in some respects it is easier not to liberate Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, but to capture or disable a nuclear power plant in Russia.
To create this fake, the propagandists used an interview with Serhiy Krivonos, former first deputy commander of the Special Operation Forces of the AFU, to the Ukrainian Channel 5. Among other things, the host asked about the Zaporizhzhia NPP. In answering, the expert suggested:
could, for example, the Special Operation Forces theoretically liberate such an object, or it's too dangerous? This is all about theory, just a theory.
In answering, the expert suggested:
if the issue is raised and the task is properly set and the risks are properly weighed, then we can also save their nuclear power plant. Because in war, if you blackmail us, we will not be gentlemen and turn the other cheek.
After all, Krivonos is not an official and was interviewed as a military expert. But with such fakes, the Russians are trying to show that we are the aggressor threatening global security and not they.
Ruslan, what is the main target group for this fake? Why are they spread? I mean, why are Russian propagandists spreading this fake?
Well, I think that the Russian population and foreigners, first of all, Europeans, are primary audience for this disinformation. And we can understand why. First of all, Russian propaganda want to persuade Russians that Ukraine is a real threat for them. And of course, Russian propaganda is interested to scare Europeans. Europeans don't like that these nuclear threats are on European borders. And that's why Russians all the time, when European countries or the United States make the announcement about military support to our country, Russian propaganda threats with nuclear weapons, nuclear strikes, and nuclear stations that might be seized by Ukraine. So I think the Russians and Europeans are the among primary target of this disinformation.
But my last question would be as follows: who are more scared, Russians or Europeans, to your mind?
I think both of them. But fortunately, Europeans understand how Russian propaganda works much better than Russians, and they have another sources of information. So we hope that they will never stop supporting Ukraine.
Okay, thank you, Ruslan, for all the work you are doing, and thank you for the work of StopFake. As I told at the beginning of our conversation, that Russian propaganda works 24/7. StopFake works 24/7 either, so that all the world knows the truth about what Russians are doing in Ukraine, about all their crimes they are committing on our territory. This was Ruslan Deynychenko, Executive Director of StopFake. This is Spotlight Ukraine. More to come. Russia go home. The president of Czech Republic, Petr Pavel, has called on Russian troops to withdraw from Ukraine. He left the message on a military vehicle of the Ukrainian armed forces during a visit to the country and posted the photo on Twitter. He also expressed his support for the Ukrainian defenders. We are with you, and you will avenge your martyrs. You will regain your freedom, the Czech president insisted. General Pavel served as chairman of NATO's military committee, the alliance's second most senior position after the Secretary General. And that's all for today in Spotlight Ukraine. Thanks for being with us. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to our YouTube accounts, Spotlight Ukraine and Espresso TV. My name is Yuri Fizer. Have a good morning, day and evening, depending on where you are now. See you.